We can talk and just go about our lives, unreflectively. Um, for example, what do I have in front of me right now? A computer screen. Of course. um, I don't need to have a theory about nominalism in order to know that. How does it really affect my daily life? Oh, okay, well, I get by without it. But if I stop and reflect on what this view is really saying, there's no way there is this real computer in front of me or anything else. So it really does make a huge difference, in several, when you tease that out in several practical ways.
Okay, everyone. Welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for theology and ethics. And today on the podcast, I'm joined by my vice president and good friend, Lenny Esposito.
Good morning.
There he is. And a good friend of ours and a former professor. I think I say former professor. I had a few classes with Scott at Talbot School of Theology. Scott Smith. Philosopher at Biola University and Talbot School of Theology. Scott, welcome. How are you doing this morning?
Well, I'm hanging in. Doing pretty good. Glad to be with you guys.
All right. Yeah, we heard you had a little issue with your foot recently, so we appreciate you joining us in spite of whatever physical C fibers firing might be going on right now in your brain. But Scott, we wanted to have you on because you've written a series of books, the most recent of which I believe is this one, which is called Exposing the Roots of Constructivism, which is a book that I've gone through twice now. And the topic we're going to be dealing with is one that really has exercised your intellectual project the last several years, and that is the philosophical issue of nominalism as opposed to realism, which we're going to get into. And, as I've been thinking about this and reading some of your work, I really felt like, boy, if there was one philosophical issue to sort of pinpoint as kind of the culprit for so many of our cultural problems and the turmoil that we kind of see in society and in our politics, it would probably be the issue of nominalism. And so before we get into the topic itself, though, maybe you could give us just a short bio, a little bit about your background, where you've studied, and what you where and what you teach right now.
Okay. Well, I am Professor of Ethics and Christian Apologetics in Talbot's MA Christian Apologetics program. I studied under J.P. Moreland and Scott Ray and Doug Guyvet at the MA program in philosophy at Talbot. I was one of the very first students to sign up and go through that program. And from there, I went to USC, and it was God's blessing. I was able to study with Dallas Willard, but I was in their School of Religion, even though I wanted to do a philosophical, dissertation and focus. And looking back, it's really interesting because that experience that God gave me there, or allowed me to have at USC, has just been instrumental now in the work that I've been focusing on, like with critical theory and all sorts of stuff. It's just been amazing, to see this unfold. But anyway, that's been, how I studied. I've been working for the Biola program or Talbot program ever since I graduated. And I have been working on projects largely related to knowledge, what kind of things need to be real, or the ontology needed to have knowledge. That has led me through postmodern kind of thought, naturalistic thought, now dealing with nominalist thought. Critical theory fits in there too.
Yeah.
And trying to defend moral knowledge, but all these with a view to help defend the Christian worldview. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. So Scott, and let me start off then as we get this discussion going on nominalism and the problem of knowledge. So this is kind of what we might say. This is really where epistemology and ontology meet, right? Is this problem of whether or not we need a certain kind of ontology to know things.
Yeah.
And nominalism is what is your thesis that really undercuts any possibility for knowledge. But let me read this quote. It's towards the end of the book, but I think it kind of sums up the serious nature of this particular issue. You say in your book, Exposing the Roots of Constructivism, I quote, nominalism is a totalizing view. There is no ontological room for a real world, much
Yeah.
less social structures, sexuality, gender, classes, races, or injustices. There would not be any good or evil. There would not even be any words or even human power. End quote. Okay, so that's
My
a
goodness, I
that's a
wrote
big
that.
statement about this view of nominalism. So
Yeah.
why don't you maybe give us kind of just a short definition first, just to get the audience oriented, and then we'll go into maybe a little bit of the history of the view, and then we'll get to some of the defenses of nominalism. But how would you define nominalism in its most basic sense?
A couple different ways. First of all, literally, the term means nameism. So it's really getting down to the names we give to things. So it kind of puts us in the driver's seat, or gives us the sense of being in the driver's seat that we get to define what things are
Mhm.
by the names we give them. So you are a human because I'm calling you a human. That's the words we use. Is there something about you though, that really makes you, uniquely a human, that defines you as that? No, not on this kind of view. It's the names we give things. And that reminds me very closely, something I like to point out a lot. It fits right in with Genesis 3:5, I think, where the appeal to Eve was that we will get to define good and evil.
Mm.
Well, I think it goes broader. We get to define reality, um, put ourselves in God's spot. Another sense, though, to nominalism, in contrast to, you've used the term realism. Um, the idea here for nominalism, everything is particular. In fact, there are only particulars. Uh, I see, on the screen here, faces of three humans, but that is just a way of speaking, because on nominalism, there would be at best human one, human two, human three, but there's nothing literally in common here that makes us all human besides the name I'm giving there.
Mhm.
Everything is particular. They may resemble each other, but they don't literally have something in common that makes them all the same kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Scott, some folks may be familiar with the famous painting that Rubens made, the School at Athens,
Okay.
and there you see,
Raphael.
Socrates.
Raphael.
Raphael, I'm sorry, you're right, Raphael. I just saw it. I was just there a little while ago. We were at the Sistine. We were at the Vatican, and it's in one of the rooms there. It's phenomenal.
That's right.
But at the School of Athens, you have Socrates. I mean, you have Aristotle and Plato walking, right? And Plato is his hand is gestured up like this, pointing to the heavens, and Aristotle's hand is pointing down. So the idea of the Platonic forms as being something above, whereas Aristotle saying no, the idea of the thing is in itself. This is kind of the roots of this conflict, isn't it? Is there something, a property or something that exists separate from the created reality, or do these properties kind of just fall into instances of reality that we see around us? So it does this kind of, I'm just using as a visual example that people may be able to grab hold of to kind of get the basic threads where this whole conflict comes from.
Well, I want to be a little careful how to interpret that painting. Um, Because obviously Plato, yes, he's thinking about the forms, these universals, pointing up, these immaterial things that transcend us. They're real. They're not human products. Things like humanness, redness, all concepts, whatever. On the other hand, Aristotle also was a realist, like Plato, how he goes about knowing those things is by looking at particulars and then inferring or inducing, what they all have in common. And he still holds to the universals, but he's pointing to the importance of particulars. Like in his biological studies, that's where he's looking at these things and then infers a universal in common. I say that because some people have, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but maybe I'm making a bit of a philosophical point here, because some people have interpreted Aristotle as being a nominalist because of his focus on particulars. And that's a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
I think, quite arguably, in misreading Aristotle.
Because it would seem,
But
Scott, in the early church history, at least through the late antique, you have, an Augustinian theology that is Platonic for the most part, but then you have the late medieval philosophical theology of Aquinas that relies more on Aristotle. So both assume essences, right? That
yes,
there are essences that
yes,
we can know. And I've heard people like maybe Peter Kraft, I read his History of Philosophy recently, say that Plato, the main difference between Plato and Aristotle is just the location, of the essences, which is maybe a simple way to put it, maybe a little simplistic, but essences, universals are still there for Aristotle, but as you said, he's going about a different method or means of recognizing, of
okay,
recognizing them, something like
that,
that.
mm,
But then, okay, so since we're sort of have shifted a little bit of a historical tack here,
okay,
because I would say, like in the medieval period, this is real. This kind of realism, right, about essences that particulars share, right, or participate in. That's that's maybe like the assumed view.
mm,
And I don't know, maybe I think this is in your book as well. You or people sort of will think of probably somebody like Ockham as
yeah,
maybe the beginning, at least. I mean, there's always somebody in antiquity we can find that has a seminal
sure,
view that
right,
hasn't quite been worked out yet, that we could call nominalism for sure. But we tend to think of Ockham as being the first one to really sort of articulate more explicitly a kind of nominalism. I mean, does that kind of seem about right? And if so, what
right.
kind of nominalism is he then articulating, and how does that sort of take off then, especially in the West?
Well, I think you're right as far as we tend to, look back to him as a major player, not the only one, I think, but a major player to trace things back to. Uh, Shift, amongst, in the overall Christian or, Catholic Christian, worldview of the time. And he, um, trying to remember all the details, with him offhand, and I'm forgetting several. But yeah, there's this shift away, from the realist, realism. I think we see in Aquinas. Some argue he's a conceptualist. I think that's a mistake myself. I see him as a realist, as well, following Aristotle's kind of path, but not so with Occam. Um, and I think part of it, for him, is a concern about limiting God's power. I think that's a big thing that's moving Occam, in this, if I remember off the top of my head
The
right.
idea that on realism, God's power would somehow be limited, and Occam wants
Yeah,
God to have a greater sort of degree or kind of power.
it'd be unlimited.
Yeah.
These if these objectively real, universal, sort of things, these forms exist,
Mhm.
then somehow they are beyond God's power.
God has to kind of work with them, kind of in some way.
yeah, yeah. So I think with Ockham, he that motivates him to move away, from a realist, kind of view, and instead to embrace that these things are what they are in name only. Um, so that's where it starts. I think when we start seeing, big changes historically in the West, and Occam's kind of view gets picked up and carried forward into the scientific revolution. Then,
Right. Now, does
so
some
we
of that, I mean, we also think of Occam with regards to the razor and his idea of theoretical simplicity. Do
Mhm.
you think, I mean, is there also something there where he thinks realism leads to a multiplicity of explanations that one would be better without, like get rid of realism?
Sure.
We have simpler theories because that would then seem to jive with the later scientific project, right?
Yeah, and I think that if the Platonic kind of view is right, there are all sorts of universals, a
Yeah.
multiplicity that we can't begin to count.
Yeah.
Um, Even for all the words we're using right now, we could get into this, but words, I think there are a particular use of a word like nominalism, right there, that I just uttered. But then there's the word itself, it would seem, that could have multiple uses. That sounds like the realist kind of view. And so it's like, oh my goodness, even when it gets down to words, we could have this multiplicity, and we've got all these different languages and
Right.
multiplicity of words, and new ones could be made. Does that mean there's this multiplicity of these universals? Oh my goodness. And so, yeah, it could really seem like a way to simplify. Um, I think that's a good general theory, uh, if it doesn't do violence to other things, like the ability to have knowledge,
Well, yeah, right,
of
exactly.
reality, and to
So
explain that.
as a general idea, idea like having less things to posit as an explanation would be better. But if it doesn't, if it's so corrosive,
Right.
right, to get rid of those things to these other things that we want to on to, like the fact that we can know things, then you have to put those objects back into play, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So
It's a
when you,
good principle, but
yeah.
that's it.
So okay, so we have Occam, we have his razor. He's probably the first sort of Western mind to sort of articulate a kind of nominalist view. It gets picked up in the scientific project, correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
very much. Um,
Okay. Do you want to expound a little bit more on
okay.
how this becomes ingrained in the Western project of science, the natural sciences?
Well, when you come to about the 16th, 17th centuries, I guess, and we get a couple of major philosophers. We get Thomas Hobbes, from England, and then we get Pierre Gassendi. And both of these philosophers have embraced nominalism, and they've also embraced another kind of view that's come up in the time that fits with it. It's called mechanical atomism. And it's a view of reality that the universe, as well as everything in it, is made up of, is made up of atoms, and we are machines. So the whole universe is a mechanism, and you and I are mechanisms.
Mhm.
Uh, and so, and everything is particular. There's the nominalist, kind of view. So these are materialist, kinds of views. On that kind of view, what's real is what's made of matter. That is sense perceptible. But universals, if they are real, they wouldn't be sense perceptible. They're abstract, kinds of entities.
Yeah.
And so if everything is what is real is really, made of matter and is just particular stuff, then it seems like the way to know it is by the five senses. And so these sort of universals end up getting kind of pushed to the side. And yeah, these sort of philosophical ideas take off, or they become a real part of the basis for the scientific revolution, which already, had, there were some discoveries before this, of new discovery of different, kinds of plants, whatnot, that Aristotle had no idea about. And so, by focusing on an empirical basis to go out and actually investigate the world rather than just simply theorizing about it, from theology and Aristotle's philosophy, it became more of an emphasis to go out and actually investigate things empirically. But when you couple that with these other kinds of views I mentioned, the focus becomes on, well, the way to know these things is by the senses. And that, again, we are bracketing out these universals. So this leads into a key distinction that came into play here, the difference between primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities were the things that people believed are true of matter. Something's hard. It's got physical extension, in space, this sort of stuff. If it hits me, it's going to have an impact, physically, on me. Secondary qualities are these other sort of things things like maybe souls, could be thoughts, could be colors, things that we can't seem to know empirically, but it's like, wow, we still want to hold on to these, as in some way, as real. But what kind of thing are they? Well, maybe they're just ways of talking, perhaps. And so this ends up causing a divide in terms of what people thought are real. Primary qualities, that's the stuff that's really real. Okay. But secondary qualities, well, maybe these are just subjective, ideas, constructs, of our own minds.
Right.
And so it starts to create this more and more consistently a materialist, focus. And by focusing on the material and the empirically observable, science takes off.
Yeah.
But it's being philosophically shaped, into, by bracketing out these universals.
Right.
And instead focusing on particular material stuff.
These other things that we seem to know, but because they don't fall into the realm of the senses,
right,
we don't want to, we start to just not deal with them, kind of, and push them aside and not really attend to them. Or maybe even outright reject, then I'll just outright reject them, or try and find, or like you said, then just call them, they're just names. They are just names of things.
There you go. Yes. And what you said there, we don't even maybe attend to them. I think that's a real good way of putting it.
Because one of the things, this is what you use often in the book, to attend to these things, or even the physical things, if the universals are in them, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a great thing I learned from J.P. Moreland and Dallas Willard, and they from Edmund Husserl. I try to give a couple examples of the chapter on science on that, where we can attend to I think I had in mind like an orange on my orange tree in the backyard.
Yeah, right.
And by attending to this, I actually can become aware of more than just the sense perceptible empirical stuff. I actually can become aware of the universal itself, the color orange, let's say, that's before my mind by attending to it.
Right.
So there are aspects, though, of science where they can't avoid these kinds of ideas, right? Because propositions, any kind of claim, is by definition not spatially extended. It's not. So a proposition is either. I'm thinking, for example, of the laws of logic themselves. They're either there's no way to empirically test the laws of logic because you need the laws of logic in order to do any empirical testing. But there's no way to do science then if you can't assume the laws of logic. But if those aren't real, if they're just names, then what do we do?
Well, maybe just to play devil's advocate, on that, perhaps they are simply regularities, that we observe, and this is our, a name, we've given, to these regularities. Something can't be both a square and a circle, at the same time and in the same sense. Well, okay, but what you said, Lenny, reminds me of something, and this gets into something you mentioned, Tony, about going later. But I've seen Bill Craig, for example, talk about propositions. And in one of his articles, he wants to get away with propositional truth and focus instead on the use of sentences. And the key move there is sentences are empirically knowable. But propositions, understood in a realist way, as are universals.
Yeah.
And so the big move then is, can we have propositions if they're really reduced to sentences? And this is something I've really tried to argue. Like, no, you can't reduce them.
Yeah.
Very important stuff, I think. But that's getting a little ahead of us here.
We've shown how nominalism, or we talked about how nominalism gets picked up as kind of the default view in the project of the natural sciences. Then you get to maybe like Hume's skepticism,
Okay.
right? With regards to whether or not empiricism is a reliable kind of view.
Okay.
We can't see causality, we can't touch it, whatever. And then you get sort of Kant trying to synthesize. I don't know if we should talk about Kant here a little bit, because he seems always so relevant in any discussion. And in sort of placing things in the mind as sort of where the mind is constructing sort of reality for us. I may not be putting that very well, but let's move up into Hume's skepticism and then sort of Kant trying to bridge the gap between rationalism and empiricism.
Well, Hume, I think, was pretty influenced by these ideas that we were just talking about, the mechanical atomism and empiricism. That he kind of he arises in the context of the flow of that. He's in 1700s. This has been developing now, for quite a while, and he's coming on the heels of, Hobbes precedes him by quite a bit. We have Locke in between historically. Hume comes along and he takes a little different tact, on empiricism, and he has this idea called phenomenalism. And instead of my observing these things in external reality, and somehow I can see this, whether or not this, actually holds up on empiricism, but nonetheless, I see your faces, or I see the image of this leaf plant, on the hutch behind me. What's really going on there? Well, for Hume's kind of view, as I understand him, there's not a real object out there that's causing these things in me. Instead, these are all projections of my mind. So there's nothing where I'm actually accessing some real world, and it is somehow causing these thoughts or experiences, in me. Instead, it's all internally driven. He says the mind, it's like a theater, and all these sense impressions are on display, before it. And out of what's called custom, I guess it's a habituated way of going on, after this theater or series of experiences, the mind projects these objects.
Okay.
So there's not really this ivy plant on the thing behind me,
Yeah.
or there's not really a car coming down the road. Although I think if you took him in his daily life, Hume would know, if a trolley was coming at him, surely he wouldn't step out in front of it.
Right. This is just a projection of the theater of my mind. This trolley coming bearing down
I mean,
upon.
he's not that stupid,
Yeah.
you know.
Right.
But on the other hand, when he puts on his philosophical hat,
Yeah.
he goes, "No, this is what's happening. That's
Yeah.
all it is."
Yeah.
So it leads to a radical skepticism, about what reality is.
Well, and this pervades the book. There's just this common sense question of, is nominalism a livable
Yeah,
philosophical view, right? Which should, when you say, it's like nobody actually lives this way,
yeah,
right? In day-to-day non-theoretical world, which itself should be evidence probably against it, right? Like livability of a view might at least be one piece of evidence that the view itself is, maybe not so
yeah.
great.
But
So,
that gets into why I think it's really important. And I'll trace this back and give credit where credit's due. It's JP again, and the arguments I saw him originally raise in his book called Universals, and he takes on what's called trope nominalism, and he tries to argue that there's no way that this kind of view can preserve what's real in reality. It can't. Uh, Based on its own criteria, if you take it seriously and push it, consistently, it leaves you with an incoherent view, such that I would say then nothing can really exist, not even the view itself. What I try to do is understand his view and then apply it and push it, to apply also to the other big branch of nominalism in theory, at least called austere nominalism. And so I'm trying to use his view and defend it. And what I found here, it's been really important to get down to that level because, for example, in my various articles that I've done with, interacting with Dr. Craig's views, this is where I think the rubber meets the road because we can talk and just go about our lives, unreflectively. Um, for example, what do I have in front of me right now? A computer screen. Of course. um, I don't need to have a theory about nominalism in order to know that. How does it really affect my daily life? Oh, okay, well, I get by without it. But if I stop and reflect on what this view is really saying, there's no way there is this real computer in front of me or anything else. So it really does make a huge difference, in several, when you tease that out in several practical ways. But again, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but
well, let's
go ahead.
okay, so yeah, okay, let's get to, let's go ahead and jump ahead to the present
Okay.
moment.
Okay.
Contemporary philosophical arguments for nominalism, and you lay out in the first two chapters of the book. You start with kind of the maybe the more robust recent defenses of nominalism. You mentioned two, and those are let's stick with those two. The one that JP has written a lot about, trope nominalism, and then we'll deal with some of the forms of austere nominalism. And then maybe after we do that, then we'll talk a little bit more about how this undercuts knowledge and all these other super important realms of life, right? So, okay, but let's tackle trope first. I mean, that's a weird that's a weird word, But what are the trope nominalisms?
In trope theory, um, they want to say that these things like properties or qualities, like color, anything that we take as a feature of reality, for example, I've got quite a bit of gray color here, or still some brown color, or mustache, or certain shape, these things. So there are colors, there are shapes, they could be thoughts. These are properties or features of me, you might say. That again, that ivy plant up there has got the property, we might say, or it's a quality of being Well, an ivy plant, and it's green and certain shapes and all that sort of stuff. The wood, beneath the hutch, it's hard, has a certain shade, shapes cut into it, and all that sort of stuff. These are properties. Well, on the trope view, these are still what they are in name only, but they want to say these properties are real. These are not just words we use.
Mm-hmm.
These are real features of the world, but they're all particulars. So, for example, back to the example, looking at our three faces here. Here is, I'm human. We call all humans. On the trope view, being human's a real thing. But we're each particular humans, and not something literally we all share in common.
Mm.
So I'm human 1. Tony, you're human 2. Lenny, you're human 3, etc.
Right.
Is there something we all literally share in common, that like an essence, a universal? No, but we really are but we're humans. So there's not something we literally share, but we resemble each other. Maybe in all sorts of, the phrase sometimes used, exactly similar ways, but not literally identical. Okay. Same with.
So we don't share the tropes that make us similar either.
Each trope is particular too. Yes.
Okay.
So my being human is, that's a trope. It's a particular, but it's a real thing. It's properties are real on the view. Let me just put it that way.
Are they? But they're not. So they're real. They would be extended in space and time then as well.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But you could also have people. I think you'd have people like Dr. Craig. Sorry, picking on him here a little bit, but as an example, he'd want to say, there are thoughts, for example. Those aren't, extended in space. Those are mental things, but they're still tropes. They are particulars. They're immaterial, but they are particulars. So I have a thought about our recording right now. That's my thought. Thought 1. Tony, you could have a thought about the recording, but that's thought 2. Lenny could have one, and it's thought 3. Oh, do they literally have the same thing in common? No.
No. Okay. Yeah.
They're all particulars. And they're real, but they're all particulars.
Okay. All right.
No universal and ties them all identical in common. The austere view says properties are not real. There are only concrete objects. This gets a little weird in a way. But instead of me being just like a bundle of different tropes, let's say, gray trope, brown trope, certain shape
tropes that have these qualities. Well, yeah, right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Instead of me being a bundle of tropes, a bundle of these properties, particular properties, I am just a concrete object that's called Scott Smith. That's all it is. And there are many different ways of describing or talking about me. But those properties themselves are not real. That's why it's austere. There's not all these different properties. They're just a bunch of concrete objects. And that's all there are.
And then we're really just giving names. We're just producing names.
Yeah, that's right.
Do we even know? And what would be... Okay. Right. We're just our minds are just producing our brains if on a natural.
How do those reference then obtain? Because if we're just producing names, this leads us to things like pronouns and stuff like that, right? Where there either is a common referent to which we're all pointing, or we just get to produce whatever names we want. It can be a widget, it can be a whatever, and who's to say that one person's name or label is better than another's, which is kind of the postmodern project. But how then does language even work? How do our ideas exchanged if these names are just kind of
Well, this is
random?
one of the applications of this kind of, a view, because when you look at the, as you called it, the postmodern project, an example of this could be what's called language games. And the key person behind that was a guy, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And his idea there is we've got to get rid of all metaphysical theorizing. We need, because that just leads us into I think I've heard this term, a metaphysical briar patch, one writer put it. All these confusing theoretical ideas that don't get us anywhere. How do we make progress and solve these things? But instead, what we need to do is look into the workings of how we actually talk. On this view, languages are just particulars, so are words, but we supposedly somehow in a community or a small group, like just say maybe we have our own little language amongst the three of us, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
and a way of talking that we've agreed upon certain rules that we'll agree upon. Oh, that's a proper use of that term, and that's a proper use of this term. So that's how we can refer to Lenny. But it's not like there's some universal meaning to this. These are just behaviors, which are particulars, that we've agreed upon, within a certain set of conventions. It's not like there's a universal meaning to certain terms or whatnot. And if we stepped out and became part of another community with its language game, and we started talking our old language, just the three of us, they're going to go, "What are you talking about?" Because languages are particulars.
Yeah.
So it's a social agreement, and it's all about behaviors,
Yeah.
and which are
Well,
particulars.
and the name of the book is the Exposing the Roots of Constructivism. So I feel like now we're kind of getting some handles on what we mean by constructivism. So you have minds or brains constructing languages,
Okay.
right? And then there's something like an agreement
Yeah.
amongst multiple minds, communities of minds, to use language in such and such a way,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And then one can move in and out of different language groups. And what really allows for society is groups that use language in a similar way, regardless of how it matches up with reality. I mean, again, language and reality are almost the same thing. Then, I mean, they're almost like collapse into kind of the same idea, right?
That's interesting way of putting it. That could use some, maybe, some nuancing, but
Yeah.
you're in our little conversation right now is reminding me of something that, and again, I feel like maybe I'm jumping ahead to where you might want to go with some applications, but I'll just throw one out there. Um, if you look at somebody like Stanley Hauerwas, a,
Okay.
a theological ethicist, but he has made this kind of turn to focusing on language, and languages are particulars. He's following Wittgenstein's footsteps. His idea then of witnessing, he's big on witnessing. He says, yes, this is a Christian practice that all Christians should do. But what does he mean by it? How do we do witnessing? Well, it's not by going out and telling people for the gospel by means of, let's say, a Four Spiritual Laws booklet or Steps to Peace with God, something like that. Because that treats the gospel as a universal that has,
Proclamation. Yeah.
yeah, and has universal meaning across different people groups or communities. But instead, we all have our own particular languages with their own particular meanings. And instead, the way we witness is by saying, okay, you who are an outsider, not a Christian yet, why don't you come and become part of our community? Watch how we live, learn the Christian language, which is more than just verbal stuff, but also how we behave.
Right.
And you can start learning how to see the world as we see it. And then at some point, you can have an aha moment where it's like, wow, this is the true story. I want to be part of this. So it's got to be, you've got to, there's no way from an abstract standpoint to be able to understand the meaning of the gospel, because there is no universal meaning to the gospel. It's particular to the way Christians talk.
Well, and one of the other philosophers you mentioned in the book with regards to ethics is Alistair MacIntyre. And I
Yes.
think you also kind of just laid out, using Hauerwas, MacIntyre's view of maybe even, he is a Christian. He's a Roman Catholic, as far as I know. At least at some point he became a Roman Catholic in his life. Yes. But maybe it's the same thing. He kind of lays out ethics that way. We can move from one community that has a certain way of talking about the moral life, maybe, into another, learn its languages, but then you put it in the book, and I remember reading this in one of MacIntyre's, but I think Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, conflicts, where he's like, you can then compare the narratives of community 1 and community 2, and see if one of the communities has more rational resources. But then I'm never sure what he means by rational resources there. And if one community has better rational resources, I guess, or a better narrative, a better story than the other, you can consider it superior.
Yes, he does say that. And for him, he's made a journey. He was, at least from I understand his journey, it started with Marxism.
Yeah.
Moved to Aristotelianism, and then to Thomism. That's quite a journey.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So to use his kind of framework, he embraced the story or the narrative of Marxism as the most rational for however long in his life. But at some point, he must have hit some dead ends with Marxist thought to realize, oh, Marx, I've never seen him explain this, but I'm just going to guess. Marxism hits some dead ends here and doesn't explain well enough certain things I'm encountering in life or of what I'm seeing happening, in society or whatever. In fact, it really seems to stuck. It can't address these issues. So maybe I should look at some other views. And because he studied history of ethics, he could look at, maybe what about, some of these other views? Maybe I should go back and reconsider Aristotle. And when he did, he could see Aristotle had some answers and could explain those problems better. In fact, in a way that is, he likes to say, rationally superior to what Marx could say. And therefore, he said, I should give my allegiance to this story, Aristotelianism, that tradition. And eventually he's gone on to say, you know what? Thomism is even superior to Aristotelianism, at least by itself. Wed to Augustinian theology, it's like, there's Thomism. That's even better still. I'm going to give my allegiance to that form of life or tradition, you'd say. Yeah.
So help me understand a couple of things.
Okay.
When we talk about real moral propositions, right? There's a morality that we appeal to as Christians, and it's always been, the Euthyphro dilemma and all this stuff of the object, and Christianity would answer that and say, well, the moral law is just simply part of God's nature. It just reflects who God is, right? The moral principles are those that are found in him because he's the ultimate form of the good. Could it be that there are other propositions that God would hold, or even properties, the idea of brownness, the idea of being a dog? If God is simple, wouldn't he have those ideas as part of his omniscience even before he chooses to create those things? And then don't they take on that same status as, say, a moral proposition? You see what I'm saying? In other words, they're real. We believe moral laws are real because they're simply part of God's nature. But aren't other knowledge propositions also real in kind of a similar sense, where we're only thinking God's thoughts after him, and though we're grasping for a label, the label is different than the concept that it reflects.
Well, I think there are a few different things probably that we could tease out there. But one thing I think I want to be um, careful to nuance there. Um, I think that uh, I'll agree with you on moral properties or claims, propositions. I like to say the word claims. It's a little easier, I think, than proposition. But the idea I have in mind is the same. Um, these are grounded in who God is and his character. Yes. Um, so God then, instanced or has created this world. And I think that there are universals. Um, I'm just asserting, my view here without, giving all the explanation for it. But there are certain universals that are communicable. They're God's attributes that are communicable to us. But does God have as I'm not sure I'm explaining this the best, but here's a shot at it. How about the moral principle that rape is wrong? I think that's a corollary, of what we say of God's, attributes, because that would be unjust, for example, unloving, all those things. But I also think that these sort of things, that the principle, that rape is wrong, I think is a universal itself. And so I think God, based on how he's created the world, which he did according to his perfect wisdom and moral character, he then established these things as universals. He's then sustained those things. He sustains those universals, like rape is wrong, in existence timelessly, I would say, too. But he sustains them existence. So rape is wrong is an actual moral principle, a universal. Mm-hmm. But then in contrast, I think justice is God's own attribute that is something that is communicable and we should have, have present in us, for example, same with love and those sort of things. A little further though, there are other things based upon how God has created the thing, like let me give a human example. Right now, I'm working on an essay on a particular topic on a hot button issue, and to create it, I have to have concepts in my mind, of what are the issues. I have to understand some of the concepts behind some of the factual issues, and have to structure this thing. So I gotta have lots of concepts of how to put this thing together before there be this final product. Lord willing, gets published. But that's how I create things. Now, God, we might speak a bit anthropomorphically. How did God come up with, or how did God create the property of brownness, the color brown? Well, we might say that God, again, anthropomorphically, God has this concept of the color brown and decided to instance it, in the world. I don't think there's a sequential thing in here, actual literal sequence of time, because I think God did this all timelessly. Yeah. But the property of brown, then, the universal he created, is not a concept. That's the key thing I want to get at here.
Yeah,
I think relates back.
Well, it's giving your
So,
Yeah,
okay.
give it your other example. So rape is wrong. Rape is a universal, but in the prior to God's creation, in the timeless Trinity,
Okay.
rape can't even be conceived, because in order for there to be rape, first of all, you have to have kind of some kind of a sexual aspect to it, right? I mean, the idea of love and selflessness can exist eternally, but as you say, when God chooses to create, that's when rape as a functional concept actually does obtain. It can't. I don't see how rape could obtain prior to a creation point. And in the same way, as you're saying, brownness doesn't obtain until there's a physical, spatial, temporal, medium in which that property can be instantiated.
Hey, one thing you said though, I'm not sure I agree with. That is, I I don't know why God could not have foreknown from eternity past that there would be rape.
Oh, sure, I agree with that. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so he would know, have a concept of that even.
Well,
We
and
don't,
I yeah.
go ahead.
No, I mean, I think having sat in Dr. Craig's class on God and abstract objects, this seemed to be the main concern of conceptualism. Divine conceptualism is that God would have concepts of very awful things, or very trivial or nonsensical things, and we don't need to go into a rebuttal of that yet, but yeah, it would seem that God would have the concept of rape even in his eternal state as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit prior to the moment of creation. And maybe that is unsavory to us, but it at least makes, I think, sense of where universals come from,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which again, we then need. So, Scott, I know
Yeah.
your time is short, and maybe we can do a part two of this,
Okay.
um, because I want to get in. I mean, we're sort of dealing with nominalism now, and I think we would want to do the corollary of that, which would be a defense of realism. We can talk about some of the things that you and JP have proposed as good options, especially for Christians to take seriously, which you've described that as sort of a modified Platonism.
Yeah.
Um, but I want to go back to, maybe we can sort of finish up here, because we had talked about moral facts, and in your book you list out um, four items of like moral principles. One we just
Yeah.
mentioned: rape is wrong, rape is evil, or rape is bad, murder is wrong. Justice, I think justice is good, and love is good. I think we're the other two, right?
Right.
Um, and those are certainly in the realm of moral, what we'd want to say, of moral facts, right?
Okay.
Um, Another thing you do in the chapter on science is you say that scientists can discern things like the sphericity of a
Okay.
healthy cell, right? As opposed to a non-healthy cell, which doesn't have that spherical shape. And that one can, in a sense, if we posit universals, one can attend both to these, something like a scientific fact, or again, correct me if I'm wrong here. If one can attend to sphericity, which then, as we see sphericity instantiated in cells, would actually give us knowledge that these cells that have this property are probably healthy ones, right?
Yeah. Right.
And the same, and then you relate that to moral facts as well. Like we can kind of see, and you give a description of how your daughter kind of came to see that murder is
Yeah.
wrong. So,
Yeah.
right, through some cartoons, from some Disney
Yeah.
films and stuff. So I set you up there for, I don't know where you want to go with that, but this seems to be the critical part, right? Is that on a theory of universals being real, then we can have real scientific knowledge. We can have real moral knowledge, right?
Yes.
And this, I mean,
Yes.
this is so critical. This is so critical, right? So I don't know if can you expound on that a little bit here before we maybe sort of tie things up?
Well, the thing just maybe to, say is I was trying to deal with some specific examples of some things we all simply condone.
Yeah.
And that's why I stayed with a short list of some moral principles. Depending on the audience, I could have added a few more, like racism's wrong,
Right.
genocide's wrong, this sort of thing. But I think what I was trying to do was appeal to things, first of all, that this is called particularism. There's some particular moral facts, for example, that I think we all simply can know. Yes, you might have an outlier out there who might simply say, well, I don't know if murder's wrong. I mean, I had a fellow grad student at USC do that, in a classroom. And I think he was doing it just to, play a role and to get a reaction from us. But nonetheless, I think there are things we simply can know. Now how do we explain that? And I think that what you were kind of sketching there was Edmund Husserl's phenomenological approach, to throw a fancy name to it, is if we simply pay attention to what we can be aware of consciously. When I'm seeing, you referenced how my daughter, learned the concept of murder from watching or attending to things in the movie The Lion King. And from many noticings of that, she could start forming a concept of what murder's wrongness. And the idea then I want to play off of, and I think is I think we all intuitively can realize this, is that once we get the concept of what it is, we simply should see that it is wrong. There's something we intuitively know. And that's why it comes back to some things we simply do know, like those short list of 4 things. So it's by attending to these things that we can notice there's something even intrinsically about, that's wrong about them. And I think I'm going to extend this a bit, but we can actually be aware of an essence to these things. Now, if you go to universals, what is it they literally have in common? A shared essence. On nominalism, there is no such thing. There's no room for that. There are only particulars. So universals allow for there to be essences in the world. An essence to rape, rape is wrong. Yes, rape is essentially wrong. Sphericity has that's a word we use, but to describe something real in reality we can attend to and be directly acquainted with if we pay close attention and bracket out our prejudices, saying, oh, I'm only aware of things that are material here, physical things.
Yeah.
No, there's more I think we can be aware of if we simply aren't allow ourselves to be blinded by our prejudices or other theories, let's say.
Because if there's not an essence to those moral virtues or vices, right? Those things that we call commendable or condemnable. It's kind of say like it's just a matter of interpretation when I see one body doing something to another body that I call it rape, other person just calls it I don't know, Swiss cheese or something ridiculous or something that doesn't capture the essence of the act, right? And that, I mean, now we say like we don't necessarily live this way, right? But I think what's problematic right now, though, and we sort of sketched out how nominalism is sort of presupposed in the culture. We are getting into these more these conflicts that seem more and more unresolvable because we're moving further and further apart from this idea that we actually are or can grasp the essence of a thing, right? Even in a moral issue, right? So we could think about, like, you talk about the intrinsic dignity of the human person. Well, if everything's just names all the way down, and then we're just interpreting names, what's a human? What is dignity? What's and you just, and then, I mean, the unborn lose out. And, and of course, I think where I'm leading this, and you mentioned Nietzsche being prescient, and a lot of people have called Nietzsche a very prescient thinker, that he saw this forecoming, that at the end of the day, it's just sort of the body or the mind that's more powerful that sort of decides what our values, virtues, what our names are, which ones we're going to use and which ones we're going to not use, sort of.
It just to reinforce that a little bit about Nietzsche, but Foucault and some others too. These were names I really heard a lot around the table of fellow grad students at USC. They were deeply enamored, with these guys' insights into power, and that these were just matters of power. Words being used to reinforce binary thinking or essentialist thinkings to conform people, to a certain way of behavior in order to oppress them. This is right where they saw this, and this is where I think we're where we are, in so many ways as a culture now.
Yeah, and you mentioned various critical theories in the book, and I've written several articles on critical theory. But then, and again, the question is like, can the critical theorist, if they assume nominalism, object to that? What's the objection? The moral objection to the idea that people just use names to is sort of to wield power. And of course, the critical theorists will claim that metaphysical theories, Nietzsche did, are a way to wield power. But then what's the what are you doing when you object to that, if not also the same thing, just sort of wielding words to try and get your own power?
Yeah.
Scott,
and
I want
to,
go ahead.
No, I was just saying, this is what McIntyre realizes. Hey, it's all a matter of power. If Nietzsche was right, and if so, we're headed for the moral dark ages. Or maybe we need to recover a prior view, like Aristotle's, for example. Yeah.
Exactly. You know what? And Scott, let's try and do this, because I'm going to end with a quote from the book.
Okay.
That I think again sums up the problem of nominalism. And then maybe we can meet again and do a little bit more on a doctrine of universals, and then and kind of working out how we can know universals and also defend the view. So maybe we'll do that in a second part of this series. But let me just to reemphasize this point about the problem of the kind of pervasive nature of nominalism. This is Scott Smith from his book, Exposing the Roots of Constructivism. I quote, "In light of the overwhelming problems with nominalism, why does it have such staying power? I think it is because nominalism is seductive. It holds for us the promise that we can make or define reality as we see fit, according to our desires, lusts, and more. Indeed, it empowers us to feel godlike, that we can define things such as good and evil, justice and injustice, equality and inequality, what counts as human, who is morally worthy, who is not, in any other aspect of reality." End quote.
I still agree.
Yeah. So that's why I really wanted to have you on, because I think there's got to be, I feel there needs to be a concerted effort to really look at nominalism, deal with its best defenses and overcome them. And like you said, recapture a view of realism about universals. Yeah.
Amen.
Indeed. All right, Scott. Well, we'll try it. We'll try and have you on again, because we want to look at universals more closely. But I appreciate the time that you gave us today. And I would just say God bless. And again, thanks for being on.
Oh, thank you. And good to be with you guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Goodbye.